Welcome, everyone, to the Spiritual Brew Pub. I'm your host, Michael Camp, and I'm really excited to have our guest today, Jonathan Foster. He's an author, a theologian. He's a former evangelical church planter, podcaster, father, and I love this, a guy who likes to hike. So I'm with you. I live in the Pacific Northwest, and we've got a lot of great hiking and backpacking out here. I hope that's what you mean. Anyways, Jonathan's books include Theology of Consent, Mimetic Theory in an Open and Relational Universe, The Reconstructionist, Questions about Sexuality that got me uninvited from my denomination. That sounds really interesting. And his most recent book is called Indigo, The Color of Grief. Jonathan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Michael. It is really great to connect with you. A lot of fun to be with you. And yes, hiking in the Northwest, there's nothing quite like that, man. That's a beautiful part of the country.
Yes, yeah, we have a lot of great backpacking up here in the Cascades and the Olympics, but we try not to broadcast it too much because we don't want too many people to come up here. Yeah. So anyways, I'm really glad that you could join us. We just recently got acquainted, and I love your work. We have a lot in common, and we're going to have a great discussion today, focusing mainly on reclaiming nonviolent atonement. We start talking about that subject, and it's a very critical subject. When I was deconstructing my faith in evangelicalism, that was one of the hardest things to deconstruct because it's kind of programmed into us to think a certain way about the atonement, and we'll talk about that. And then, it's just, how do you, is there another way of looking at it that we weren't taught, that's more historical, that's more biblical, that's more logical, etc. So that's what we're going to talk about. But before we get into that, we want to set it up and hear a little bit about your background. What is your faith backstory that got you to where you are?
Well, there's a long backstory, getting longer.
There always is. You can
getting
do the
longer by the moment.
Version.
Yeah, that's right. My dad was a pastor. Both granddads were pastors. I come from the Church of the Nazarene, and for the most part had a really good upbringing, had a wonderful family, and my parents loved me. And it's funny, I heard my dad preach a lot about love. So I got a lot of good stuff from him. I also got a lot of legalism imported into my life, primarily through him, and because he was very interested in what the church thought. So it was a really interesting mix of good and bad, but the good was always a little bit stronger. And so that really helped me later in life when I needed to kind of unwind some things. So yeah, I'd never wanted to be a pastor because I knew all about that, but I had some musical gifts, so I kind of got into church planting as a musician, and then decided to be a lead pastor and planted a couple churches. And I was already kind of thinking probably a little bit more progressive than maybe some of my theological, upbringing might have wanted me to. But it wasn't too big a deal. You know how church planting is. You're kind of off you're off doing your own thing. I always think church planters are kind of like field goal kickers on football teams. Like, no one really understands what they're doing. No one really wants to interact with them. They just want you to make the field goals and, help you win a few games. So I was doing that and then enjoyed that for the most part. And I had 3 kids and my partner and everyone, we kind of did it together and grew up together. But the inciting incident for me in my life was New Year's Day 2015. So previous to that, we'd already gone through quite a bit of loss and some really, really intense kind of dramatic stuff. But unfortunately, on that day, our oldest child, our daughter, was killed in a car wreck. And so at 4:30 p.m., New Year's Day 2015, my life changed literally in the span of a heartbeat. Her heart stopped in the span of a heartbeat, and our whole world changed. So that served to really fast track me on a lot of stuff. I did not ask to go down that road, obviously. And I wasn't really mad at God. I wasn't really mad at the church per se. I know since then I've been accused of that a lot, which I always find curious and interesting. But really, I just became deeply, intensely curious about, I think, probably love, because I had so much love for my kid.
Hmm.
And I believed, again, like what I'd said with my pop, and my parents and my heritage, like I had that love. And I never got the sense that God was separate from the tragedy, that very much God was right in the mix. And if people get a chance to read Indigo, they'll hear some stories about
Right, right,
deep entanglement of that. And so, in a lot of ways, what I've been doing the last 9 years and 3 months, I've really just been pulling at the thread of basically, what does that mean? How is it that beauty and pain are so entangled and really are two sides of the same coin? So that led me down a path of just continue my education, and I finished a master's. And then my friend Tom Ord invited me to jump into his open and relational thing. Meanwhile, I got introduced to Rene Girard, which I know we're
right.
probably going to
Yep.
talk a bit about today.
Hmm.
Girard gave me some handles on some stuff, and then my dissertation wound up being bringing Girard and process influenced open and relational together, watching all that happen. So I've written some books. We have a nonprofit in Haiti. So yeah, that is about as quick as I can make
Right.
50 some
Okay.
years of
Right.
craziness.
So yeah, it sounds like you grew up in an evangelical church, but they really did focus on love. I assume that the typical evangelical theology was behind that, but you know, and then
Kind
maybe
of. I mean, Church of the Nazarene is a Wesleyan background, so it's not
okay,
Calvinistic, but it's funny how it works out, because I tend to call it Americanized Christianity. Winds up being just, it's an amalgamation of a lot of stuff, including some, I think, really unhealthy atonement stuff. So even though we were Wesleyan, a lot of Nazarene churches wouldn't wouldn't know it,
I see.
unfortunately.
Yeah, all I know is that when I lived in Southern California, James Dobson went to the Church of Nazarene and
That's
Sierra
right.
Madre,
That's right.
and so I just equate it with typical conservative Christianity. But there might be differences in churches, of course.
Hmm.
Um, but anyways, we're going to get into what you mentioned, atonement theory and so forth. But a little background information for folks to give us some context. One of your books is mimetic theory and open and relational in an open and relational universe. So, what is open and relational theology?
Yeah, yeah. It definitely influences.
I know you could do
Um,
a course on it, but again,
right, right, right. Yeah, it definitely influences all my thinking at this point. And yes, it is. There's a lot to it, but essentially, to try to answer the question as directly as possible, the open piece has to do with this idea that God experiences time moment by moment. Sometimes we say God is time full, does not live outside of time,
mhm,
and experiences it with us. The future hasn't happened yet, so God doesn't know exactly what's going to happen, because the future in and of itself is something that just hasn't taken place. Doesn't mean that, different open and relational thinkers will process this in different ways. When I talk about it, I don't necessarily think that that means that God is not maybe got a good idea of certain things that might happen based on patterns and what he or she has seen before. But yeah, we reject the notion that God has exhaustive divine foreknowledge of everything that's going to happen in the future.
right. I see. Yeah, a different way of looking at the omniscience. I mean,
Yeah.
and the omnipotence of God.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Right.
very much
So,
so. It invites you to disassemble omnipotence, omniscience. However, I'm happy to say I'm still really excited about omnipresence. So
yeah. Right.
still got that omni going
Yeah.
for
We
me.
have to have at least one omni, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And then,
So, yeah. Go
sorry.
ahead.
Well, I was just going to continue on. So then the relational piece is this idea that we think that everything is, like, reality is telling us that everything is deeply interconnected, or entangled. That's a great word for our day and age. The fundamental building block in a materialistic, mechanistic universe might have been the idea that, an atom, or we could drill down further and find subatomic things that might be the building block. What science seems to be telling us is that actually there really is no fundamental building block as much as that fundamental thing is relationship. Everything is connected to everything else. And this is true in the micro. This is true in the macro. What open and relational theology does is says, well, this could very well be true of the divine too. It seems to be really congruent with certainly what the Bible teaches and with our lived experience, with the idea of love. And so
Right.
The thought here is we want to reject the notion that God is separate, and to use a theological word or a biblical word. Well, I don't know if it's a biblical word, but it's a theological word. Impassible, immutable God that is unaffected by us. We're very interested in leaning into the reality of entanglement and interconnectedness. So that's the relational piece, and it goes hand in hand with the open piece, and there's lots of implications.
Right. There are. Yeah. I know it can help people in many ways rethink things like the problem of evil in the world.
Yes.
We're not going to talk about that. Sorry, and then I'm really sorry for your loss. I mean, I just can't imagine going through that. But I mean, did that help with your thoughts about what happened to your daughter and grief?
Absolutely, as you just implied or suggested, ORT, open and relational theology, gives me a reasonably intelligent, I might say it that way, a reasonably intelligent way to begin to hold all the tension and the antagonism and the pain and the hurt and the questions that I have about where the expletive was God when that happened.
Right.
And
right,
for that
exactly.
matter, obviously I'm not the only one. You have experienced things. We've all experienced things, not to mention the massive injustice that people groups have experienced. So all of that stuff, that open and relational stuff, and also the mimetic theory, Girard stuff, has helped me. Again, there's no great, perfect answer to the problem of
Yeah.
evil, but
Right.
there are answers that are less sucky than others. And
Yeah.
I really feel thankful that I'm been on this journey. I'm not thankful for the losses that I've had, but I'm thankful for the journey because it's allowed me to get to less suckier theology.
Right.
How's that
Yeah.
for a
That makes
a
sense. I like that.
recommendation?
Less suckier theology.
Yeah, right. That's about as good as you're going to get with me. So
Right.
sorry.
So, and we're talking about, we're mentioning mimetic theory, and I know that was in the title of that other book too, Theology of Consent. What is mimetic theory?
Yeah. So Theology of Consent wound up, it's essentially my dissertation. And then, as you can imagine, the consent piece became an important thing for me. And the subtitle is, right, mimetic theory in an open and relational universe. It's where I'm trying to bring these two massive thoughts together. And I succeeded in some ways. In other ways, there's still a lot of work to be done. So mimetic theory comes from a French intellectual by the name of Rene Girard, who then, actually I say French, I mean, he was born in France, but he lived most of his adult life in America. Was a really important thinker. So it's I'll try to run through it, give an elevator pitch. Just our listeners need to know, or viewers, as it were, or whatever. This needs to be a long elevator ride. It needs to be like a
Right. This is not going to do it justice, but we'll get a hint.
right. It's got to be a tall building, and
Right.
If there are any Girardians listening, they'll be scandalized by the things that I omit. But I'll do the best I can. And having done this a few times, how about I just try to lay it out, and then you can come back and ask
Sure. Go ahead.
questions, because the way I see it, the fastest I can make this and do justice is it's a fivefold movement that plays out against the backdrop of two things. So there's a lot to talk about. But anyhow, real quick, you asked, so I'll give it a shot. It plays out against the two backdrops. One we've already talked about, which is relationality. Girard comes from the psychoanalytic kind of movement with desire and hidden desires. This is Freudian and Hegelian and Lacanian. And the whole idea here is my desires are always being influenced by the desires of others. I never really know exactly what I want until I'm around other people. That is just a reality.
That makes sense. Yeah.
It's a relational reality.
Mm-hmm.
So your desires aren't created in a void. So it's relationship. The second piece of the relationship, which is not often talked about as much as I think it should with Girardian type folks, is that what this does is it always kind of puts us in a state of unease because we're never entirely sure what the other person is thinking. So we're never entirely sure what we're thinking. And so this creates like some anxiety. Girard has this great idea, this great quote about how that we're constantly living in this dark country of anxiety that subsists within us and whose action upon us never ceases. So it's that sense of the unease. Okay, so the five-fold movement that is not linear, but I'll just lay it out that way because it's helpful, is that this desire, the first one is desire. So my desires are always the desires of someone else. Like our marketers or advertising people, they know this the best. They're not going to show you like the soda that you want to drink. They're going to show you the soda your model wants to drink, and then you desire the desires of your model.
Right.
Of course, what's challenging about that is that model is a real person. They're going to go home at night or whatever they do, and they're modeling their stuff after some other model. So it's this constant connection. Gotcha. So we desire the desires of others, and then that puts us in a little bit of, well, first, the second piece would be then we begin to imitate each other. So I want to drink that soda because my model does. This inspires both me and my model to think in terms of scarcity rather than abundance because there's only so much soda. So it drives the value of the soda up, but it also drives our own tension up. And for Girard, this inevitably leads to the third piece, which is conflict. So now we've gone from desire to imitation to conflict. And now we both want this thing. Initially, it's triangular desire. It's going after the soda. By the way, obviously, this could be anything. It could be a degree. It could be the girl or the guy. It could be whatever. I'm just using the soda because that came to mind. So initially, it's triangular desire for the soda, but ultimately, it's more sinister than that. Girard says that we really want to assume the other person. We want to become the other person because we assume that they don't have this existential anxiety and lack. We're trying to become like them.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Desire leads to imitation, leads to conflict. And then the fourth piece is probably what Girard is known the best for. And it's this idea of, well, how do we alleviate this stress? Because this conflict builds and builds and builds until I am standing on the edge of the precipice, pointing my finger at the other guy with the soda. He's pointing back at me. We both want the same thing. Now, obviously, sometimes we go over the edge. All of us know that that happens with humanity. But what Girard discovered, or sometimes they say uncovered, based on his anthropology work, based on his novelistic work, and then eventually he remembers his his Catholic upbringing. He remembers the Jewish scriptures, and he starts connecting all the dots. And so he devises this, again, maybe uncovers more than discovers, our ingenious way to deal with our anxiety, which is to scapegoat.
Scapegoat, right.
That's right. And it's more than blaming. It is a psycho-spiritual projection where we offload our anxiety onto the backs of others, which then justifies us getting rid of them. And so we murder them, lynch them, push them in the gas oven, throw them in the volcano, don't sit with them at the lunchroom table, write bad social media posts. List is endless. So desire, imitation, conflict, scapegoating. And then the fifth thing definitely is not talked about as much either. The fifth thing is the repetition of all of this over the centuries. And repetition turns into ritualization, and liturgy is added to this. And essentially what we do, we don't say this word for word, but when the crisis builds back up again, by the way, I need to take a quick step back. Part of the reason we do scapegoating is because it works. It actually alleviates the stress of the crowd. It's kind of a cathartic movement. And so then the next next time. It's a cathartic movement, but it's fake. It doesn't last forever.
It doesn't last long. It's short term. Yeah.
That's right. That's right.
Things seem like they're okay now, but eventually you'll see they're not.
It'll build back up again because we live in a relational universe full of this anxiety. It's a part of what it means to be human.
Right.
So for Girard, religion emerges out of all this because as we repeat that sequence, as the crisis builds back up again, essentially we go, well, what worked last time? Oh, what worked last time was to create a victim, and then there was peace. And so we deify that victim, we add liturgy to it, songs to it, prayers to it, and we do it over and over. And so religion for Girard is born out of our inability to deal with our own anxiety, and we become violent about it. And that's about the quickest I can get through.
Okay, well, that's a good Cliff Notes version. We're not going to quiz anyone on this, but we can always put something in the show notes that goes, hey, if you want to learn more, here you go there. So that's great. And that's a good place to pivot and go into our main topic today, which is this notion of atonement, and how so many Christians believe in what we would call a violent atonement. And then we're going to kind of unpack that and see if there's any such thing as a non-violent atonement. So the most popular atonement theory today in evangelicalism and fundamentalism is penal substitutionary atonement. So what does that mean, and where did it come from?
Yeah, well, so what does that mean? First of all, I'm not an atonement expert, but yes, I have lived in this world a lot. And for me, in my journey of disassembly, reassembling, my journey of deconstruction, reconstruction, I don't think there's been anything more important than me wrestling with these atonement ideas and trying to get to something that might be not as violent and punitive and retributive. So what is penal substitutionary atonement theory? It's basically what has emerged in the last couple hundred, 300 or 400 years, depending on how you timeline the thing, that is birthed out of it's kind of connected. It's actually a lot connected to a thing called satisfaction theory, which Anselm created in the 11th century. And so it has some of that. It's colored in some of those ways. And then it's really informed a lot by, that would be feudalism, and informed a lot by the law, and how when the law is broken, God is not only dishonored, but that there has to be something that reverses that dishonoring. And the only thing that can really do that would be a sinless offering. And so you enter Jesus into the mix. And so those who are into PSA, penal substitutionary atonement, will want to make sure that they, of course, Jesus is sinless for them, and then it's a perfect sacrifice. And then the substitutionary part is how Jesus takes on our sins that we should have had. And so now somehow when God looks at us, he actually sees Jesus. And then his wrath isn't stirred up because of that, because of the obedience of his son, and the son takes on the sins. And basically PSA moves everything to this moment of, well, it gets kind of fuzzy because you got torturing and whiplash and all that stuff, but essentially it moves everything to this moment. And I hate to say it, but it becomes transactional when all this takes place. And so if you can just adhere to that thing, then something like metaphysical, cosmic happens, some transaction, and then now God is able to offer forgiveness.
Right. Yeah. No, the transactional is the right term. It's also called an economy of exchange, where you can't be forgiven unless some exchange happens, and unless a transaction happens. And in this case, Jesus has to be literally tortured and murdered on a Roman form of execution, a very gruesome form of execution. And only then will God forgive you, or at least consider forgiving you. But you have to do something else too. You have to accept this atonement and, agree that he's taking your sins and ask for forgiveness, etc. So let's unpack that a little bit more. What are the unhealthy aspects of this? I mean, why is this bad if it is, and how does it impact people and how they view God?
Yeah, so it's a really good question, an important question. And first of all, I always, when I'm on these subjects, want to say that if someone's listening that is still really steeped into PSA, I don't want to be disrespectful to your personal belief. I'll be honest, I don't have any problem being disrespectful with the systems that
Hmm.
promote PSA, but I don't want I wouldn't want anyone to think that I'm trying to lash out at you personally, because we're all essentially meaning making creatures. We're trying to figure out life, and for lots of us, religion has become really important, and in Americanized Christianity, PSA is as important as anything within. So I know that you've been, creating meaning this way, and so I apologize. But the question is, what is unhealthy about it? In my mind, there's a bunch of stuff that's unhealthy about it. Things like it paints the picture that God could not offer forgiveness without sacrifice,
Right.
which is, first of all, not what the movement of the Bible is trying to tell us. In fact, Jesus quotes, oh gosh, is it
Hosea.
Hosea a couple of different times? I desire
I
mercy.
desire mercy, not sacrifice.
Right, right.
Is that the one you were
So
thinking?
that's the one.
Right.
Um, so it's anti-biblical in that sense. It's also anti like lived experience for me, because having had children, never once did one of my kids come to me and ask for forgiveness and me tell them, wait a minute, I'm going to have to go beat one of the other kids in order for
Yeah.
me to offer forgiveness to you.
Right.
In fact, it's unconscionable. So it paints God as kind of like, and I guess my point there is, me as an average earthly, whatever human, if that's what I'm thinking and not doing, how much more so with a God of love? So it puts us in this weird position of potentially like uh, child abuse. Like if anyone saw what we say God needed out of His Son Jesus, if we saw that in you or I, people would be calling CPS on us.
Right. Right.
So that's unhealthy. This whole notion that God couldn't forgive before death. I mean, God was forgiving in the Old Testament. Jesus
Yeah.
himself was forgiving before he died,
Exactly.
and and
Yeah.
and encouraging others to forgive. You want me to keep going?
Yeah. Keep going, man. Roll with it.
Well, it continually feeds into our notion of the only way we can address like our anxiety is to just squash it and crush it and kill it and dominate it and beat it down. It's a very, in that sense, it's a very violent kind of a thing. And I think that's an anti-human, because you're never going to get rid of all of your anxiety and all of your stress and all of your problems and all your tension. And I don't think I don't think that was the point. I don't think Jesus went to the cross to fix our problems. I think there's a bunch of reasons why Jesus is at the cross, but one of
Yeah.
them
We'll get
is,
to that. We'll get to that in a second. Yeah.
yeah, but one of them is this idea that he's following the invitation of love, and I see him arms outstretched, holding the world together, not fixing, but holding the thing. And so I think a really healthy human move is to be able to do whatever you can do to live with and embrace your tension. That doesn't mean that there aren't things that you're going to want to work on, and
Right.
we're constantly in growth and process and change. But I think it's misleading to put us in a situation where we tell people, oh, you can fix this and God's going to fix this, because life is replete with problems. And I've experienced a lot of those. So I don't think that's healthy. I mean, what else? I've already said stuff that has lots of implications.
Yeah. Well, I think if I just add a few things, one of the things that I think of is that you have a warped view of forgiveness with this theory, because it's really, when you unpack it, it's not true forgiveness.
Right,
God only forgives if a transaction takes place and it happens to be a violent one,
right,
a gruesome one, and forgiveness doesn't take place unless you agree with that transaction, even though someone might go, that seems like a sacrificial, violent God. I can't accept that, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you have to kind of agree on a violent God in order to be forgiven by this God, and it warps the way we view God. And I
Mm,
think that's really one of the most detrimental things, is that
mhm,
God all of a sudden is transactional. And
mhm,
you know, we can't really, we don't really know if God has to, uh, let's say, balance the scales of judgment by having someone punished in our place, right? What kind of a God is that?
yeah.
And the other part was, a lot of times Christians will say, or evangelicals in particular will say, all right, well, we're sinful and God can't look on sin. He's angry about our sin, right? And so when you accept Jesus, now God sees Jesus, not your sin, your sinful self. And you're like, well, what is this? God love me or not? He seems like he only loves me if Jesus is in front of me, right? So
Right.
all these types
Yeah.
of things. How does that,
Oh, yeah.
how does
You just
how
said,
do you see that?
right. You just said a whole bunch of other really important stuff. Like the first thing you said made me think, it begs the question, how can you call something forgiveness if it's paid for?
Yes.
Because we all know forgiveness is a free gift.
Hmm.
That doesn't mean that it's not costly. There is a price to pay, but it's the person doing the forgiving that's paying that price, because that tension, that antagonism has to kind of go somewhere. And so when the person forgives, that's the great magnanimous thing. It's not that, oh, we figured out what the currency was and now that gets paid. So I think that's important. What you just said about sin made me think of, um, yeah, it's more of a modern day idea that anything that is unethical or immoral and sinful, and we haven't defined any of those things, so I'm just lumping them all together, but has to be punished. But our idea of punishment is so informed by retributive, punitive, like just discipline, punishment for the sake of punishment. And I just think a lot of us don't even think about, like, even in the American legal system, there are times when criminals get pardoned, when people get pardoned. It's actually a legal move. Well, when that happens, it's not as if the judge is saying, "Oh, well, now we've figured out what can make up for this." Let's just say someone committed a murder. I mean, there is no making up for that.
Right.
What happens is, at that point, we as a society have said, "All right, we're going to pardon this person, and we're going to give them a second chance." Well, if we can do that, surely God can do
Right.
that.
Right.
Um, so it just colors so much of the way we approach who we think of as God. And the bottom line is if God is a God of love, which is what the Bible says, then it presents some really conflicting issues with this whole thing, that God needs to be paid off, or needs to be appeased is another big word, assuaged. His honor's got to be restored. No, man, God
Right.
is love, like a good parent. A good parent
Right.
knows that it's messy and just risks and is vulnerable and gets into it with their kids. I think that's the way it is with the divine.
Yeah. No, those are all good points. And like you said before, we wouldn't, forgive our children only by making someone else make a payment, some kind of
Yeah,
a punishment. So why would God do that? And it's it's it really begs so many questions when you unpack
hmm
it. And I think most
hmm
Christians just don't unpack it. They just kind of accept it. But I think, at least from my experience, in the back of my mind, I was always thinking, like, for example, if something went bad in my life, and this, then some people think, oh, God must be punishing me. Something, I must have done something wrong. Because I'm supposed to be living this good life now that I'm in Christ. And so it just conjures up all these questions that for people, that make it really difficult for them. It's like when you have a
yeah,
punitive God over your shoulder, right? It's very stressful.
Right. And if you add that into this idea that God already knows everything that's going to happen in the future, which we already
Right.
just kind of briefly
Yeah.
touched on with open
Right.
relational stuff, that's a deadly mix. Well, God knew this was going to happen, and I'm being punished. Yeah, it puts us in a really difficult position. It's fascinating. You might relate to this as well, and maybe some listeners, but there's been several things that have helped me, but one of the things that's helped me over the years is to just get into a little bit of psychology, and not only to get some therapy myself, and not only to study it myself, but also to talk to counselor friends. And I was amazed to think in terms of like just very basic Carl Rogers kind of stuff of like the counselor, there, no matter kind of what therapy you're using, psychoanalysis isn't quite this intense, but all the other forms, the idea is you give unconditional positive regard. You're
Yeah.
creating a space where that
Yeah.
person feels at home. And the kinds of things we're talking about, I connected the dots one day and I realized, oh my word, theologically, we have not done a very good job. Actually, we've done a terrible job of creating unconditional positive regard. We have set this thing up where the poor babies are born into humanity saddled with an unpayable debt because of something that someone did, you know, centuries before. And it's the opposite of unconditional positive regard. And when you start pulling at that thread, man, you realize it is connected to everything. It's connected to our thoughts about hell and about um, any kind of deviations from normal patterns in society. If you want to talk about sexuality and those kinds of things, yeah, it's connected to a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
So
Right.
it's really important. Yeah.
Yeah. It's very critical. I mean, I think of also, the practice of spanking your kids, for example,
Mm,
and the doctrine of original depravity. All these things are kind of
mhm.
tied together because, why does
Patriarchy.
God have to have a payment? Because you're a depraved person, and like we talked about, original sin and this burden of being right from the start, being not good enough, and it just unpack when you unpack it, like you said, it's like pulling a string, and all these other problems surface. So
Yep, yep.
let's pivot to talk a little more about what if that's unhealthy. What
Mm,
is what's a healthy way of viewing the cross? Is there a meaning
yeah.
behind Jesus dying on the cross? What's a more historically accurate way of looking at atonement?
Well, I'll tell you how I answer that. I'm not sure I know. First of all, I guess I want to say that atonement in general, there's a bunch of different theories that the church has had over the years. We've had satisfaction theory atonement, we've had moral influence, we've had Christus Victor, we've had penal substitutionary atonement, we've had liberation theology that's helped us see it a little bit differently. We've had process feminist, like my friend Catherine Keller. I don't know if she would say this exactly, but I imagine her saying something like, feminist theology is less concerned about atonement and more concerned about the kind of people that our atonement theory fosters, that
Hmm.
creates. She would say
Hmm.
something probably creative like that would turn it on its
Yeah.
head. And then you've got, which I assume we'll probably talk about, but, Girardian influence
Yeah.
and open relational influence stuff. So when you say historically accurate, this is this is some of the deepest waters that our tradition has waded in over the years. And so I wouldn't want to suggest that like there's one. Okay, I think there are healthier ways to look at it. I'm not sure that there's one like
Right.
better way.
One
I'm
right
hesitant.
way. Right.
Right, I'm hesitant in a hierarchical
I
sense, but I
agree.
definitely
Yeah.
think there's some healthier ways to look at it. And now I've forgotten the second part of your question that I've rambled about that.
Oh, just
Oh,
how would we describe the meaning of the cross if it's not
right.
PSA?
Right. There you go. So, having made that disclaimer that there's a variety of different ways to maybe approach it, the way I approach it is clearly, as I've already said, I'm so thankfully steeped in ORT and um, mimetic thinking that has colored the way I think. And maybe I'll start with, this isn't original with me. I don't remember where I first read this, but I found it to be really helpful. And I think it's very congruent with mimetic. What mimetic theory does is it doesn't allow you to like scapegoat and blame the other person. You have to admit culpability to the problems that are going on. So when I think of atonement, every time I see the word, and I've already thought about it in our conversation today many times, I don't think atonement. I see at one meant.
Oh, right. Okay.
And so what the scapegoating idea has helped me to see is like, no, I'm actually at one with the people who killed Jesus. I don't get to blame the Jewish leaders for doing this,
Right. The Romans.
the Romans, right? I see in Herod and Pilate and Caiaphas a piece of myself.
Yeah.
So that's a piece of at one meant. Also, at one meant could be, and I think is, the at one meant that Jesus had with victims and with sinners.
Mm-hmm.
He, of course, was called a friend of sinners. And so this is someone who voluntarily becomes associated, lives in relationship with all the people who fell outside of the circles, obviously. And it is one of the things for sure that got him into trouble. And in the Jewish tradition, to go to the cross means literally you're cursed.
Mm-hmm.
You're taking on a cursed thing.
Right.
And so Jesus takes on this cursed position. And a step further into this at one meant with being with the cursed is to see how the mythic patterns of the way our civilizations have evolved have always led us to believe, like in the Oedipus story, and this is part of the work that Girard does. He goes into different mythical stories throughout humanity, demonstrates how essentially it's a little bit hard for us to get because we live in quote unquote more modern times, and so we don't operate quite this way. Oh, and also because we've had the benefit of Christianity for a couple of thousand years, that's been telling us that the victim is actually not guilty. But up until Jesus' time, the idea has been that there's a reason why this is happening in our society. There's a reason why bad things are taking place, and it's got to be someone's fault. And so that person becomes the victim that everyone gets to blame and punish, and then now the gods can forgive us. So Jesus becomes at one with that mythic story, but what's different about the Jesus story is that he's not guilty. Everyone knows that he's not guilty.
Right.
It says 7 different times in the New Testament story that Jesus is innocent.
Right.
In fact, maybe the very first quote unquote evangelist in the history of the Christian movement was the Roman soldier who watches him die, and he says, surely this man was the Son of God. He didn't do anything wrong.
Right.
So the point that Girard draws out is that no, this is a story that very much is congruent with all the other mythic stories, but in this case, the victim is innocent. So Jesus becomes at one with the guilty person crucified.
Right.
One more piece of at one moment, and then we can talk about it, is I think really crucial for me. I finally realized, oh no, this is also an at one moment between God and Jesus, between the divine and human. So God was in Christ, not counting our sins against us, reconciling the world to himself. He's not reconciling himself to the world. He's reconciling the world to himself. He's with Jesus. So sometimes in that PSA-driven thinking, the idea is that God had to turn his back because, and you said this earlier, these things are all interconnected, because God can't look upon sin. God is holy.
Right. Yeah,
which, by the way, is a Habakkuk 1:14 verse that does say that. Habakkuk is saying, I'm paraphrasing, he's saying, God, you can't look upon sin. But no one ever reads 1:15. 1:15 is, then he goes on to say, well, then why do you?
Yes.
So the prophet is basically complaining that God, you shouldn't have to put up with this. Why do you do it?
Right.
And it's so true. So God is with Jesus, and what this, it's complicated because now you're like, oh, God experienced this death. God was open to this evil thing, but that also, last thing I'll say, and I'll turn it back to you, is that also is reflected in Jesus's life, because never once do you find Jesus, saying to one of the disciples, "Oh, Peter, take these sinful people away from me. It's burning my eyeballs. I can't even look at them."
Right, right.
That's not what's happening. Jesus is very much entangled into the relational context of his day. And so I think it's the most plausible thing to think of God being entangled with Jesus. So I've just given you three at-one-ments that mimetic
Yeah.
theory helps me with. At one, me at one with the murderers,
Yep.
Jesus at one with the victim, God at one with Jesus.
Right. No, those are good. And what you're describing to me means the cross is not a transactional thing. It's a transformational thing.
Mm.
It's something that when you wrap your head around it, you go, wait a minute. Jesus actually took all this. It wasn't God's wrath. It was humanity's wrath. And he was willing to, in the cause of doing the right thing and loving his enemies, going so far and not being violent, he was willing to actually, be sacrificed like this, but in a transformational way. Because while he was on the cross, he said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." I mean, right? He, he didn't say, "Father, forgive them, now that I've taken the punishment they deserve."
Right.
Right? It's like a direct forgive them, even and letting them off the hook because they don't know what they're doing. And so it's a totally different message than what PSA says.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think that these are the kinds of things that are transformational. When you wrap your head around them,
Mm-hmm.
it's like, oh, okay, if God is like that, and we are, and then like you said, admitting that we are like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the hardest things to do, is that to understand that, what would we have done if someone had, come to us and said, "Hey, you were with Christ, you were one of them, and you had a fear of being arrested by the Romans, and maybe you would get crucified too, or you would be thrown in prison."
Oh, yeah.
And then how would you react? Right. So it kind of exposes us, but at the same time, it tells us we're forgiven without having to make a payment.
Right. Right.
Yeah. So it's when you
And
unpack it, it's just amazing.
yeah, the implications are endless. They just kind of ripple on forever. It's really quite amazing. One of the things I thought about when you were talking there too was this idea of like, well, someone might say, well, what does it matter? Like, okay, what does it matter that God is a violent God? It's God. He can do whatever he wants. Well,
Right.
it matters because we build these, now we turn around and build religious institutions that reflect and mirror the kind of God that we serve. And if you have a hierarchy
Exactly.
God who
Right.
needs his pound of flesh, I promise
Right.
you, I know, we all know, we've lived this. What happens is then you have institutions that also eventually, though they don't say it and they won't want to say it and admit it, they also need people to adhere to the hierarchy and stay within the box. Otherwise, what? You get scapegoated, you get kicked out. I mean,
Yeah.
that's literally what happened to
Right.
me in my denomination that
Oh,
I just
right. That
mentioned.
book, you were right. You
Yeah,
got kicked out of your denomination. Right.
exactly. Because I didn't adhere. Well, this is a whole nother story, so we don't have to get into it. But that is that me being literally hung on a cross on a hill outside Jerusalem? Of course not. So I'm not trying to say that I'm
Yeah.
Jesus in
Right.
that respect.
Right.
But is the spirit of that thing the same? Absolutely.
Yeah.
It is a
Right.
form.
Scapegoating spirit. Right.
Yeah.
It doesn't
And
have to be
so
murder to be scapegoating.
no, no, it doesn't. It's a spirit of scapegoating that's existed. And yes, Jesus steps into that scapegoating mechanism voluntarily. He doesn't do it because God makes him. Jesus says, I have the power to lay my life down and pick it back up again. So for me, that is a fundamental key element that I'm unwilling to negotiate at this point. It's a consensual, voluntary thing, but he does it and he turns the whole thing upside down. We've never been the same.
Yeah, that's right. So now, for me, it was really hard to deconstruct PSA. It's so ingrained in evangelical theology. Why do you think that is? Why do you think why wouldn't people think, oh wow, oh yeah, that makes sense. God isn't violent. Jesus demonstrated that. So PSA doesn't align that. And then the way you're talking about it makes more sense. Why is it not like a quicker transition to embrace this?
Man, I'm just laughing so that I don't start crying because it is the story of my life. Like, to me, this is actually the good news. This is the good news that God is actually love and does not need this kind of fabricated scapegoating mechanism to be
Right.
seeked in order for him to get put in the mood to forgive. So there's probably a lot of different reasons. I'll tell you what I thought of first when you asked is it's remarkable how when you're conditioned to think a particular way as you're growing up, you're indoctrinated. You're, to use a more pejorative term, you're brainwashed to think a particular way. So if you grow up in a system, which many of us have, that is telling you that it's built upon fear, it's built upon blame and scapegoating, it's built upon the inability to sit with and hold your anxiety and to need to scapegoat all of that and to push it off into others. And you're watching your loved ones and your parents and these people that form you, because we're all, as we've already talked about, we're formed in relationship. So I'm not a neurologist, but I know, neurologically speaking, that your synapses are firing in a particular way to try to create meaning and try to get to peace. Because at a subconscious level, what I think is going on is that all of us recognize, oh man, this thing it's basically out of control. There's no controlling how life goes. It's really nuts. So we're trying to come up with ways to calm our amygdala, so to speak, and calm ourselves down. And we've been conditioned to think certain ways. Our synapses have fired certain ways. Grooves in our brain have formed in a particular way. So now when you start to try to tell your brain to go down a different groove,
Mm-hmm.
it is incredibly hard. It makes sense because we've spent a lifetime up until this point saying, no, go down this way. This is the way. It, among other things, what it does is it just gives me great respect for anyone who might reconsider or rethink anything, let alone religious ideas, because so much of it has been built upon fear. So that's the first thing I thought of when you asked that question, like, why is it so hard? Well, it's because psychologically and neurologically, emotionally, relationally, we've been going one direction for a really long time. It would be odd if it wasn't hard.
No, that's true. That makes sense. I mean, it's kind of like a programming. I mean, you're basically programmed, and honestly, in many cases, brainwashed, in my mind, to think a certain way about these things, and we're not typically taught to think for ourselves.
Right.
That's another, if you're thinking for yourself, you have to think God's thoughts. Our understanding isn't like God. And so you don't trust your own logical reasoning about things. And so there's a lot of things going against you to try to change your mind.
Yeah, Michael, what I thought of when you said that is this overriding theme in more like Calvinist circles. It's the idea that you're worthless, you're born in so much sin, and you can't trust yourself, and on and on and on. So yeah, when it comes time to think for yourself, of course that doesn't come second nature. What's interesting is even in like my Wesleyan context, where you're not saddled so much with that kind of thinking. However, it eventually seeps in because in the Wesleyan context, we love to tell people to die out to their desires. They got to pick up their cross. They got to identify with the crucifixion, and in the sense that you can't. So it's the same kind of deal. You can't trust yourselves, and eventually, what it does, if you're not careful, is it creates a rivalistic tension between you and God. Now there's a mimetic struggle because we keep telling all of our people that God's the only one who really knows what you should do with your life. you don't. You need to die out to your desires.
Right.
It can get weird and unhealthy. So I'm glad you said that, because no matter kind of which strain you come from, there's pathways into why we can see how it's really difficult to become a person who thinks for yourself,
Right.
which is
No, that's
unfortunate to say the least.
that's true. I mean, definitely found that to be true. It's difficult to give yourself permission to do that, because you don't,
Yeah.
you feel like that's sinful or something. The other thing that really helped me was, we mentioned historical things. Is like PSA, when you look at it, it really started with Anselm, right? With the satisfaction theory. And then Calvin later on put the penal part on it, and the
Mhm.
punishment and the legal terms on it. And so it's not even historical, So
Right.
people will argue that it is, but when you look at the history, you don't find it there. So um, that, I think that's one of the things that helped me, and it can help many people, is like, okay, you can give yourself permission to think for yourself. You're not going to fall off a cliff. Okay. God's not
Right.
going to, send a lightning bolt down on you. You're thinking for yourself.
Right. Right.
I always argue that Jesus actually assumed that people thought for themselves, and he used logical arguments to convince people to love their enemies, right?
Mm,
Is that, you don't just, if you just only greet your friends, even the most worst sinners do that. What
right.
makes, so he used logic to try to persuade us. So I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But also the history part really helps people. It's like, wait a minute, if this is not even historical, if you go back far enough in history, then why do we believe it, right? And that really opens up people's minds if they're willing to go there.
Yeah. How about Eastern Orthodox Church? They have never, from day
No,
one, thought this, and even after
nope,
Anselm.
mm-mm,
So that's hilarious, because I didn't even know what an Eastern Orthodox was till I was
me neither.
probably late 30s, maybe early 40s. But that's a third of, roughly speaking, a third of the Christian movement since day one. They've never believed this stuff. So when people tell me, which they do frequently, oh no, this is the gospel, you're like, well, you just relegated a third of all the Christians who've ever lived off to
Right,
whatever. So
right,
you're
yeah,
absolutely right. Our atonement theories, like everything else, have been in constant evolution and change and flux, because contexts change and words change and situations change. So I think you and I live, and our listeners live, in a great time in some sense, because now we get the benefit of having to be able to look back and to kind of lean into the healthier aspects of this. And it's a great time to lean into less violent approaches to the crucifixion.
right. No, absolutely. And yeah, you're right about the Eastern Orthodox. I didn't know that until I deconstructed, and just, about 10 years ago, I started realizing, like
Yep.
you just said, these people rejected this, and they rejected Augustine's original depravity as well. So it's like
Right.
a whole nother paradigm out there that's historically goes traced back to the beginning and the Eastern Church. So it's fascinating. So we're about running out of time, but you've got a lot of books, and folks. I think Theology of Consent is one that really matches some of the things that we're talking about today. And but they're also, I love that title of how you got kicked out of your denomination. That's that just begs to be read right there.
Yeah, it does.
But
Yeah, it does.
finally, you have your latest book, and
Mhm.
just I mean, about I assume it's about the grief that you've gone through. What, just share very briefly, what's your goal for that book to help people?
Yeah, man, you've asked some deep questions. I feel like I've kind of been all over the place. So the listeners should know that I really do think I'm a better writer than a better interviewer about this stuff. But Indigo, yeah, it's initially it's about the loss of my kid, and this really weird absence that was created in my life, that in no time at all I realized was more than an absence. It was an absence that became a presence. There was a relationship there that was gone, so it was formless. There was nothing there, but the energy was forming me. And
Okay.
the paradox of that absence becoming a presence, formless forming me, the paradox of that really stayed with me the whole time, and has caused me to try to think and approach this from different ways. And not the least of which is, I wonder what kind of emptiness exists in the heart of the divine that energizes she or he. I find that really interesting. So yeah, I played with that. It's a poetic. It's a very much an open and relational influenced theopoetic kind of a way to wrestle with grief. I think it's not long. I think it's by far the most important thing I've ever written and probably ever will write. I think it'll open a lot of doors for people to just maybe think in more creative terms about what's going on with pain and life and loss and art and beauty and all that.
Okay, good. That sounds good. Sounds like that really going to help a lot of people.
I hope so.
Jonathan, this has been wonderful talking with you, and I love this conversation. We'll put some things in the show notes for folks. Where can they find you if they want to find these books?
Sure. Well, you can, the easiest way to track me down is to go to jonathanfosteronline.com.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, all the books are on all the Amazons and Barnes and Nobles and all those kinds of places, so they can find that there. But if you want to go to the website, that might be the quickest way. Okay. All right. We'll put a link to your books in the show notes too. So, and your website. So, all right, folks, thanks for joining us today. Jonathan Foster, thanks for being on. This has been really enlightening. I know it's going to help a lot of people. We covered a lot of ground. We didn't do too bad. We did cover a lot of ground. Yeah.
So, but this is just the tip of the iceberg. So, Jonathan's got a lot of content for you. I've got a lot of content on some of these issues. So check us out and go deeper. And until the next episode, folks, enjoy responsibly.